Florida. I'm excited to be here tonight to speak with you about Malta. I'm going to try to make it as interesting as possible. One of the things I decided to do is not prepare a script so that I can have more of a discussion with you guys with regard to this material. So I see in the room tonight Professor Tykot, who is my faculty advisor back in the day when I was getting my PhD. So I want to say thank you for coming. And Uzi Baram, who basically is my mentor at New College. These two individuals, I probably would not be standing here without them, to be honest. So I'm very thankful to them for being here tonight. I just wanted to say thank you for being here. So I'm going to talk to you about Malta. And one of the things I like to tell my students, when you think about archaeology, we tend to not realize that the archaeologists have egos. And our egos are really profound. And in fact, we love to speak about the past as if it's fact. But I'm going to make a suggestion to you tonight that everything that we do is only a suggestion. And why do I make this argument constantly? It's because we cannot say for 100% certainty what something was in the past. Now, tonight I'm going to be exploring with you ancient ceramics using scientific methods, and that gives us raw data. The other thing I tell my students that there is raw data, there is analysis, and there's interpretation, and then there's representation. Representation usually takes the place of like a journal article or a published book on the research that you're doing. But beyond the raw data, as soon as you move from the raw data, your biases are starting to kick in. And so a little anecdotal story, just a couple of days ago, I got a little review on a journal article draft that said, where I used the word, this suggests this conclusion. And someone said, it's not a suggestion, it is fact. And I said, I'm going to pick my battles. Since our opinions agree, I'm going to say it's fact too. But the reality, I'm going to make a lot of suggestions, even though the science really indicates it's closer to fact. Why do I say that? Because we don't actually have the written language of the ancient Maltese during the Neolithic and Bronze Age. We do not have their words to tell us exactly what was going on and what these things mean. But we're going to do our best using science. And so I just want to give a little background. I tend to be a little processualist, which means I'm all about the science. If the science doesn't show it, I have a hard time accepting anything beyond the science. However, from a post-processualist perspective, I like to be reflective and basically tell you what my biases are right up front so that you know when I make my interpretations, where I'm coming from when I make these interpretations. I was asked earlier tonight if I'm Maltese. I am not Maltese. My heritage is Sicilian, even though I was born and raised here in the United States. My research involves Sicily and the Mediterranean. And the reason why I chose this area of the world is because it is related to my heritage. And I feel like I could speak towards that. And the truth of the matter is, it all stems to a question that I was asked a long time ago in high school by Father Saunders, a Jesuit. Am I willing to abandon everything I've come to believe for absolute truth? And for me to answer that question, I have to dig deep, and I have to go ethnographically deep. And so ultimately one day I decided to become an archaeologist, and that's why I'm here. Ultimately, I'm studying what is the truth of everything I've come to believe, beginning in the area of the world where my family comes from, which is the Central Mediterranean. So where is Malta? How many people have been to Malta? How many people don't know where Malta is? Well, Malta is in the Central Mediterranean. It's about 90 kilometers south of Sicily. On a really, really clear day from Mount Etna, you could actually see Malta, right? It takes probably back in ancient times, if in a dugout canoe, probably took the whole night to get there, about good 12 hours to go from the Sicilian coast to Gozo. It's not too far away from North Africa. It literally is in the crossroads of the central Mediterranean. In terms of the composition of the country of Malta, it's actually an archipelago. It consists of the island of Malta, the island of Gozo, and the island of Camino. There's this little islet called Frifa off the coast of the island of Malta. It's a bird sanctuary. No one really can go there. For the most part, the only inhabitable islands that were during the Neolithic and early Bronze Age were Malta and Gozo. There isn't really any indication that the Neolithic or Bronze Age Maltese inhabited Camino. We do have Roman ruins on Camino and Punic ruins on Camino, but in terms of the ancient Maltese from the Temple period, there is no indication, based on the archaeological record as we have it right now, anyone occupied Camino at that time. So how big Malta is, I think context is important. Geography and geology is so important to understand, to know what we're talking about. Well, the entire archipelago of Malta can fit within Hillsborough County. Yeah, can fit within Hillsborough County. And I don't know if I can get rid of this little. How do I get rid of this thing? So, I mean, you could see that the island of Malta is about 246 kilometers and Tampa is 282. And Tampa is one city in Hillsborough County. The island of Camino is only 3.5 kilometers. In terms of the USF's main campus, which is about 6.9 kilometers, that whole island can fit nicely within USF's campus. It is not a big place. And this is important to keep in mind, especially when we're doing provenience studies involving geological clays. And more especially that we haven't found any kiln sites or any sites where the firing took place for these things to be produced. We don't know if they were produced in separate communities or if there was one location that could furnish all the ceramics for the entire population. The latter is possible because you could technically walk the whole island in a day, right? You could technically go from one end to the other. In fact, it's interesting, if you look carefully, you can see the airport takes a pretty big slice of the island of Malta itself. It's not a big place. So the other thing you should be aware of a little bit when we talk about ceramic provenience studies and we're doing something called elemental trace compositional analysis, you have to know something about the geology of the location. So the island of Malta, I'm going to keep it simple. The islands of Malta are made predominantly of these stratigraphic layers. You have this upper coralline limestone, then you have this green sand layer, then you have this blue clay layer, which is the layer in which the clays would have come from to make the ceramics. You have this Globigerarian limestone layer, and that sits above a lower coralline limestone layer. You kind of can see it within this side piece. Side view of a cliff and how those different stratigraphic layers play out. Here you can see an outcrop of the blue clay. One of the things I like to point out is that you notice the different bands of color in the blue clay. That indicates different amounts of calcium carbonate. As you go towards the top of the clay formation, you're going to have more gypsum because of the green sand layer. And as you go towards the Globigerarian layer, you're going to have increases amount of calcium carbonate. And right off the bat, that tells us something. That not only can we potentially determine where the ceramic clays come from, which clay source they come from, but we could even probably, to some degree, figure out where within that location the ancient people got the clay specifically. And in fact, when we look at the trace elemental compositional analysis of the actual clays, we could see that each area there's a different color has its specific signature. So that's pretty fascinating, I think. The other thing you need to keep in mind is chronology. Context and chronology two of the most important things in archaeology. If you don't have your chronology straight and you don't have your context straight, you really don't have anything. And so I want you to know exactly when we're talking about. We're talking about the Maltese Bronze Age. Specifically, what I'm really interested in is the Temple period, which is pretty much between about 4000 BC to about 2400 BC. And when you think about this in terms of, and the Bronze Age is between 2400 BC to about 700 BC, compared to the Eastern Mediterranean, which is predominantly everyone thinks about when they think about the Mediterranean. What they're really thinking about, from what I get, is the Aegean and what's going on in the area of the Levant, especially today with all the news that's happening. What does this chronology compare to that side of the planet? And so I think this is really important, especially when we talk about culture change and some of the potential interpretations that we can make of what we're seeing and the evidence that you're about to be exposed to, right? Could we be seeing an influence from the Eastern Mediterranean based on changes in the chemical composition of the ceramics? So you have to be able to line up the chronologies. So we know at the end of the Temple period, we're in the early Bronze Age in the Eastern Mediterranean. That means between the end of the Temple period and the Targine Cemetery phase, or the portion of the Dark period of Malta, we're definitely could potentially seeing Mycenaean interactions in this part of the world. And in fact, one of the arguments I make, I ultimately don't think there was a population displacement in Malta. I know some people might have read that somewhere, that why did the Maltese Temple period culture seem to disappear? I make the argument it never disappeared, that there was actually a population integration by Mycenaeans. There's actual textual things that we can make reference to over in the eastern part of the Mediterranean, specifically something called the Nustoi, which are these epic cycle poems that talk about how the Mycenaean warriors after the Trojan War never returned back to Mycenae, and they left for the central Mediterranean and other places of the Mediterranean, and that's where they stayed. They never made it back home. And I think what you're potentially actually seeing in this part of the world, some of that play out. And we're going to look at that real quickly. So there's an early debate. Was Malta during the Temple period, during this important period of cultural uniqueness, isolated from the rest of the central Mediterranean? Why do they develop a megalithic society that cannot be observed anywhere else in the Mediterranean world, or Europe, or North Africa, or anywhere for that matter? In fact, prior to the discovery of Göbekli Tepe in Anatolia, the Maltese had the earliest known architecture in the world. The megalithic temples of Malta, or the megalithic structures of Malta, were the earliest known forms of architecture, over 1,000 years before the Great Pyramid. And in fact, I think I would make the argument, and even considering Göbekli Tepe, it is still right now they can still make the claim that they have the oldest representation of a deity that was ever made in humanity. And it was a woman. It was a mother goddess figurine that we call the portly woman or the fat lady. Someone used that term before, but now we're using the term mother goddess. And it would be the earliest depiction of a god on this planet, in all humanity. If depending on what we find, like a place like the Göbekli Tepe, I think that it says something very interesting and peculiar about Malta. So why did they develop this unique culture? And was it due to some form of isolation, or their nature of being an island society, insular from the rest of the Mediterranean world? And I'm not going to go into too much of that debate, but I would tell you, I don't think Malta really was isolated, personally. In fact, I think they had regular contact with the rest of the world. And matter of fact, I'm going to show you some evidence of that. And the reason why I think this is the case is that they had some form of self-imposed isolation, which you would see similarly during the Edo period of Japan. So Japan had regular contact with the rest of the world, but their self-imposed isolation limited its access to the society from the outside world. We have an example that we could look at that period in Japan as an archaeological ethnographic study of what could potentially be happening in Malta at the time. Because to say that Malta was isolated and had no contact with the rest of the world at this time would be completely incorrect if you actually looked at the archaeological record. Because when you look at the archaeological record, you immediately find imports at every phase of the Neolithic and Bronze Age, including obsidian. There's no obsidian on the island of Malta. It is a limestone rock. It is not volcanic. There is no volcanoes in Malta. You will not find anything igneous or anything that's volcanic on Malta. If you find anything that's a volcanic type of rock, you know it's imported, right? Lava. We find lava in the archaeological. Obviously, that's coming from Mount Etna. So there must have been contacts from Sicily. And in fact, when we look at the Gray Scorba period, we definitely know there was constant contact between the two periods between Sicily and Malta.
What do you mean you have lava?
We have preserved lava.
Like ejecta from the mountain?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Not like someone like chipped away at it and like brought like put it on a pedestal.
It was just found in the record. Yeah. Pumice. Again, there's no pumice from Malta. Or you have flint, greenstone axes. Now they found ochre, and you could do a compositional analysis of ochre, and we do know that some of the ochre that was found in Malta was locally produced. But we also know that a large amount of the ochre that was used in Maltese rituals came from abroad, particularly places like Sicily. Sicilian alabaster, faience beads, sulfur possibly from Sicily, ostrich eggshells, obviously not Maltese. And then, of course, as we get into the Bronze Age, we find lumps of lead in sheets of silver and different types of metal saws and bronze rivets and ingots and bronze daggers. Why is this important? Because Malta has no natural metal. You don't have tin to make bronze. Matter of fact, there's nothing redeeming about Malta in terms of raw resources. Not to be offensive. Right? There is no reason, but that's probably why, for the most part, when you actually look at the archaeological record until you get to about the Middle Bronze Age, you find no fortifications in Malta. You don't see any evidence that was any type of war going on ever, or any type of conflict among the people that lived there. Because one, they didn't have anything that anybody wanted. And during this time, it is known that the Mycenaeans were looking for one key thing, tin. Because their tin sources coming from the east were starting to get a little hectic, and they did wind up going into the central Mediterranean to look for that very important commodity to make bronze. When you think of tin, think about how oil plays out today. Tin was the oil of the Bronze Age, the early Bronze Age. Whoever controlled the tin was the global leader. The Mycenaeans were like the United States. They wanted to control the trade. And so that's what they were interested in. They were not necessarily even interested in conquering the places that they were staying at, even though they would make colonies in different places. But those were merchant colonies to basically secure their trade. We don't find any Mycenaean trade colonies in Malta. But we do find some Mycenaean things, and I'm going to get to that. We also know that based on some graffiti found at the Targine Temple, that they had use of boats. We have depictions of their boats that they used. And matter of fact, some of the interpretations now suggest that the way the temples were aligned might have to deal with, during at least one phase of the temple period, which is the Gigantia phase. They believe those temples were aligned to the Southern Cross and the False Cross, which had to deal with more with navigational patterns between Malta and other locations. That some type of navigational ritual might have been taking place. We see a change in those types of alignments when you get to the Targine phase of the temple period, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But we do have evidence based on their own iconography that they were seafaring. In fact, we could maybe try to make the interpretation. It is highly suggestive that some of these spiral patterns that we see constantly everywhere might have something to do with waves or some type of current, represent some type of current. Obviously, that's conjecture. We don't know what these symbols really truly mean. We can only interpret them based on the total context of what was going on for any one particular period of time. So in terms of theory, there's so many people had so many different theories about ancient Malta. I'm not going to get into it. The way I look at it is that, everyone who has a brain has an opinion of what happened in Malta during the Temple period and the Bronze Age. And again, egos play out, and you pick your battles. So a general question we might want to ask ourselves, well, what was the nature of Malta's isolation and connectivity with the rest of the central Mediterranean? I sort of answered that a little bit, but we're going to specifically look at the role pottery played in Malta's prehistoric trade and interaction networks. So there's this general hypothesis that if the Maltese islands were experiencing a form of isolation due to its distance from Sicily and elsewhere and its insularity, physical isolation, or because of a cultural decision to take an internalized worldview, basically cultural isolation, which is, I think, predominantly is more the explanation, or some combination of both, it would seem likely that pottery would not have played any role as either an item of import or export in the archaeological exchange relationships with other communities in the central Mediterranean. Now, here's something I want you to keep in mind. Even if ceramics are not playing a role in this, doesn't mean that Malta didn't exchange other things during these periods. They might have exchanged things like purple dye, because we have found dye vats, especially in the area of Borj-Nadar. That might not have survived in the archaeological record. They could have also produced enough of agriculture to use as exports. That would not survive necessarily in the archaeological records unless we have some title lists that would demonstrate that somewhere. We could do some type of complex analysis on that. We could potentially do residue analysis on ceramics, but that's another thing. A lot of things that they could have traded with other people may have not survived. We're just looking at the ceramics. You need to keep that in context. That's why I wanted to say, just because the ceramics show one thing, it doesn't mean it's the full picture, right? So there has been prior research to mine. None of them have done anything I've done. That's what I'm going to say. So some of the prior research looked at basically using things like X-ray diffraction. Well, how were the Maltese ceramics made? What was the firing temperature for them for their production? There have been some elemental compositional analysis that were done during the Punic ceramics, a little bit of the Bronze Age, specifically dealing with one site at Tel Silge. And there were some thin sections done in the Borj-Nadar and some stuff done in Borj-Nadar dealing with the Middle Bronze Age. My research deals with the Neolithic and the Temple period, as well as some of the Bronze Age. So basically, the prior research laid some foundation to give us a better understanding of the ceramics. But hopefully what I was going to achieve with this is getting a better understanding about the provenience of the Maltese ceramics. So this brings me to the science. I joke with my students all the time that if they read my literature, they will have the best sedative in life. Because when you read my stuff, you can say, I thought you were an archaeologist. I said, yeah, I am. But it sounds like chemistry and statistics. I know. Right, so that's what I do. I do a lot of chemistry and statistics, or use or other types of tech. And what particularly I'm using to study, or that I use to study these ceramics, is this device called the PXRF, a portable X-ray fluorescence device. It's a non-destructive way to analyze the ceramic composition of artifacts. To analyze artifacts, to analyze their trace elemental composition. And one of the things I get asked, well, could something affect, what sorts of things could affect the trace elemental composition of ceramics? Could firing, for example, affect the chemical composition of ceramics? So if you get a piece of pottery shard and you know it was burnished and had some type of firing process, would that affect the bulk chemistry of the ceramics? The simple answer, no. The bulk chemistry is intact. That means we can look at the trace elemental composition and not worry too much with regard to the firing process that was used. And the trace elemental composition of the ceramics should match the trace elemental composition of a geological source that clay that they used to make that piece of pottery came from, right? So again, we talked a little bit about the aim of my research already, and was to determine the role of that pottery played in Malta's trade and interaction networks. But there were some surprising things that came out of this research, and that's what I want to focus on a little bit. But before I do that, I just want to talk about something. You might ask me, how does this work exactly? Well, I'm not going to make it too complicated. Generally, what happens is that this device shoots like an X-ray beam at the ceramics, right? And there are these things called electrons that circle around the nucleus of an atom. And when this X-ray beam hits the atom, the electrons jump out of their outer orbital shells into a lower orbital shell, and then it wants to go back to homeostasis and essentially moves back into its original shell. And in that process, from a subatomic process, it sends out these fluorescent waves that get picked up by a detector on the device. And that energy that wave represents is unique for each type of atom based on the orbital composition of the electrons around each atom. So carbon has a certain orbital composition compared to nitrogen, nitrogen compared to hydrogen. You get the idea, right? How many people do chemistry? Right? And specifically, I was looking at these trace elements of composition. Elements: thorium, rubidium, strontium, yttrium, zirconium, niobium, right? All the fun ones. Real quickly, this was basically the shard count for each site that was part of my study. There were over 300 and some odd shards that I analyzed. I forgot the exact number now, I think 349. We have most of these shards come from temple complexes in one hypogeum, Halcephliani. You might ask, why didn't you use any domestic sites? And the reason for that, at this current point in Malta's archaeological history, we haven't really discovered any domestic sites. We only have the ritual sites, with some exception. There are two sites that, one, they call it the priestly huts, but and we do have the dolmens. We have some stuff during the Middle Bronze Age, but for this period of time, we have nothing that's been found that is related to the domestic living of the ancient Maltese people. Not even the kiln sites. We don't even have those sites. We just have the temples, pretty much, in terms of where we get our artifacts from. Here's a distribution of those temples within the island of Malta. I did some analysis of some of the ceramic shards from Gozo, from Gigantia, from the big temple there. Another interesting thing to make note of in terms of geology, you see this blue on the map? That's the only places where clay outcrops exist on the island of Malta. So immediately we know that if you're at Tarjin Temple, or if you're at Borj Nadar, or if you're over here in Manidra or Hajakim, you have to go up there around Sporba and in those places to get your clay. So that tells you that each of these communities were sharing clay sources. This is important because Colin Renfrew, who is the world-renowned Colin Renfrew, he proposed a theory that each of these clusters of temples represented unique little chiefdoms that were competing with each other through some form of competitive emulation. Well, when I look at this map, I want to say to Colin Renfrew, I don't know if that's really true. Because if they were competing with each other, they were definitely walking into each other's territories to get to the clay. That means it seems like they were more cooperative by nature to do that. Yeah.
I have a question. While you're looking at the chemical analysis of the makeup clay and where they were getting from, what they were doing with it, what about the styles of the ceramics? Do you see that certain clusters have certain styles, and does that go along with your chemical analysis?
Yes, it does, and I'm going to get to that. Matter of fact, the decorative motifs and the stylistic motifs become really important in the analysis when we look at what's going on in the Tarjin phase, and you'll see why in a second. So remember I talked about analysis. So when does the analysis begin? As soon as you plug in the raw data into SPSS or some statistical package. And let me explain why I make this distinction. Because the raw data is the raw data, unless you didn't do the method right. If I didn't use that PXRF right, then my data could be flawed. right? But I like to think I did it correctly, right? I took enough of samples, the data is what it is. There's not too much interpretation beyond the fact that this is the parts per million. Now with some of the new devices, you could have parts per billion of how much of that trace element is represented in that ceramic shard, right? Now, we need to make sense of that data. And so you plug it into a statistical software package to do something called principal component analysis. We want to see how things cluster together, map out, to see if there are relationships in the data, essentially. Can we see that easily through a statistical analysis? Well, as soon as you enter that raw data into that analysis, I tell my students, that's when the interpretation begins. But that's when you start moving away from, you start getting to the next degree of subjectivity in your analysis. It is what it is, because when you ultimately get are these types of graphs, and then you have to really immediately begin interpreting them. So if you map out all the shards from all the time period, all the phases, this is the graph that you get. And you look at it and say, okay, I don't see anything, right? It doesn't make sense. It looks like one big cluster, and yes, but there are patterns in them. And so naturally what you have to do is start parsing out the periods. So the very first period you parse out is the Neolithic period before the Temple period. Because at that, and during those phases, the Gardalam phase, the red scorba phase, the gray scorba phase, we believe based on comparisons of stylistic features and decorative motifs, we see shared cultural practices between Sicily and Malta, like the Stentinello phase ceramics in Malta we can find in Sicily we can find in Malta. In fact, when we look at the trace elemental compositional analysis of some known Sicilian ceramics that we use as test pieces, they actually are found in Malta. These Stentinello wares were not made in Malta. They came from Sicily, and these little X's, yellow X's, they are graphing nicely in known areas of Maltese clays. That means they were being exported into Sicily. These ceramics were found in Sicily, but they're made with Maltese clays. Yes?
Do you think the Sicilians came and got Maltese clay because it was hot stuff?
No. They have an excellent clay there. It has something to do with the fact that probably, I would guess, at that period of time, there was just greater interaction between the two. And in fact, there are some indications in environmental studies that one of the reasons why people may have originally gone to Malta is because of the reduction in forests and farmland, that they needed more farming. And so Malta was an ideal place for some families to start anew, and so they went there. Oh, you can see it, like I said, when I figured they could met them.
You said you found Maltese pottery or Maltese clay in Sicily.
In Sicily, yes.
Was it fired in Sicily? You tell.
That is a good question, and I didn't determine that. Could you determine that? Yes, you can. How would you determine that? Using XRD, X-ray diffraction. You could see what temperatures that clay was fired at and compare it to statistically compare it to the types of things that we know about the firing temperatures of clays that were being produced at Malta compared to Sicily. And from that, you could maybe determine if it was clay that was moving between back and forth, or it was just ceramics. But honestly, I'm just making a guess with that. I have a feeling, I'm going to make a guess, it was just ceramics that were moving between the two islands. Yeah. So we do see ceramics play out as something in the exchange networks, at least between Sicily and Malta during the Neolithic. During the Zabouche phase, which is the first phase of the Temple period, which, I kind of find it interesting. We call this the Temple period now because really and truly, you don't see the type of megalithic construction until the Gigantia phase with Gigantia. But whatever. We do see, to some extent, Maltese clays, Maltese ceramics statistically being associated with Sicilian clays as well as we are seeing things that have similar stylistic motifs with Sicily clustering within the clays in Malta itself. This would indicate, generally speaking, that there's still very close cultural connection between Sicily and Malta at this time. That this is not when Malta goes on its tangent in terms of cultural isolation. It's an interesting question to ask why at this point. Why do we see something different in the Gigantea phase? Here we find nothing from Sicily, whether exported or imported in Malta. And in fact, all the Maltese ceramics fit nicely within the clay samples that we have in Malta. These were all locally produced, and that's where they stayed. What's interesting too, this actually confirmed the understanding based on seriology and other things done like in cultural history, done by Evans and others, what we call the non-science ways of doing archaeology from previous years. It kind of confirmed their understanding, their theories of what they interpreted from the archaeological record in terms of Malta's interactions in the Mediterranean world. But here's something where it gets really fascinating. It's the Targine phase. And so this has always been a puzzle for me. And it's these, you see these black dots right here? No. You don't see them.
You know, it's like
kind of toward the left side of the graph, towards the bottom.
yes.
Those particular charts are made of clays that are not statistically associated with clays that I've analyzed in Malta. Now, a couple of explanations. It's possible that there was a clay source in Malta that I did not have access to, right? And I couldn't study, or maybe it was exhausted. Or if you ever go to Malta, you know that most of it's now concrete, so it could be under concrete. That's always a possibility. It's another possibility. It represents some clay source outside of Malta. It could also be equally a possibility that represents a clay source that's both Maltese and outside of Malta. These are your three options. But they're not completely Maltese, except for when we look at the stylistic features and the decorative motifs. The decorative motifs are all Maltese. The clays are not. Interestingly enough, most of these ceramics come from one specific temple, Borj Nadar. This is really fascinating because Borj Nadar temple is believed to be a late phase and the Targine phase construction. And I'm going to show you something in a little bit that kind of becomes sensational, right? Which might explain a little bit of something. But the chemistry doesn't lie, right? We're seeing something change in Malta during this period in the Targine phase, at the end of the Targine phase. We also know at the end of the Targine phase into the Targine semi-Targine phase, which is the early Bronze Age, thermyware is found in Malta. Thermyware is believed to originate from the Peloponnesian, Peloponnnesia, right? That peninsula, which is, everybody knows the Mycenaeans and the Greeks and all of them are over there doing their thing. And so, but they're moving around and they're bringing their thermyware, and we do find thermyware associated with the end of the Targine phase. Are they bringing clays with them? Right? We know that they transported clay with them based on shipwrecks that we've uncovered. We know that the Mycenaean ships had clay that they were bringing with them. Could they have brought clay with them? And when they went to Malta, for whatever reason, you know, they said, here's some clay, right? Give us some food. I don't know, right? Or maybe they fell in love. That was actually one of my theories, is that what you're really probably seeing in the area of Borj Nadar, maybe Mycenaean men falling in love with the local women, and they stayed. And they said to the ladies, here, you know, here's some clay, right? This is my gift to you, right? And it was quite possible that in Malta, it was women who made the ceramics, not because that was the woman's role, because women may have played a bigger role in the ritual process of the temple. It was a sacred feminine. It looks like, based on all the archaeological evidence that we have, it is all centered around the sacred feminine. right? It's a possibility. It's an interpretation. So in the Targine cemetery phase, we see the first actual Sicilian wares, Maltese wares in Sicily coming back into the exchange. Those red X's were Maltese pottery found in Sicily. Right? So we know that ceramics are back into production. And then in the Borj-Nadar phase, ceramics don't seem to play as big of a role in exchange, which makes sense because during the Middle Bronze Age, which is the Borj-Nadar phase, metals were predominantly of interest at this point. So this leads me to this one shard right here. This one really important shard. This one right here. It's an amazing shard. You know why? Because it's Mycenaean. Found at Borj-Nadar. The one place that I've been talking about that has this unique set of chemical composition of certain ceramics. What's this Mycenaean shard doing? We don't know. But when we analyzed that shard, guess what we found? It's made out of Maltese clay. It doesn't come from Mycenae. It doesn't come from anywhere except from Malta. And the question is it a Maltese knockoff? I mean, that's really the question. Is it a Maltese knockoff? Did someone from Malta probably go to Thapsos in Sicily, where there was a Mycenaean colony, saw some type of ritual wear being done because it's from a calyx? We know it's from a calyx. In fact, we kind of have these reproductions of the shard based on different Evans or Tanasi that each have their version of what they think the calyx look like. It doesn't matter, right? But we know it's a calyx. We know it's a ritual vessel. Did someone from Malta going to Thapsos on some trade expedition in Sicily see this ritual set and say, I'm going to make that in Malta, and they made it with Maltese clay? We won't know. Yeah.
What about the guy coming over that makes the pottery and says, great, this is clay that I like, I'm going to stay and mix it?
He could have. That's another possibility. But we do know that this particular shard was found with some similar types of things that we found at that collection of vessels that were in this ritual repertoire stuff that they would have used at the ceremony.
I just want to go over this very clear. Nothing about this is Mycenaean except for
its decorative,
the decoration.
The decoration and its stylistic features. It's from the clay, the raw clay, the material that's making it.
Material
is Maltese.
Made out of Maltese clay.
Yeah.
It's designed in the style of Mycenae.
Yeah.
And it's a calyx.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So makes things more complicated, right? It would be easy if it was something was Mycenaean, right? Just like came from Mycenae. That would help explain a lot of things. But here's something interesting. What are we really observing here with all this? We know something's happening in the Targine phase, towards the end of the Targine phase, into the early Bronze Age. We know that in the Targine cemetery phase, which is the early Bronze Age in Malta, we see some other interesting things happen in Malta. So we look at the total context. We know at Targine, the temple complex at Targine, we find an example of cremation practice, only there. So this is not a burial practice that was predominant in Maltese society. The question is this Peloponnesian?
Right.
It's very limited.
You have no physical evidence.
We have no physical evidence. But we have no physical evidence. But I would point out something. You see this kind of looks like a little figurine with a halo. There are similar artifacts like that in Malta. In Mycenae. So it is quite possible. I'm not sure if it's actually Mycenaean as much as Dorian. What do I mean by that? So Dorians are a type of Greek with the Mycenaeans who were different from the Mycenaeans. So the Mycenaeans didn't generally practice cremation, but the Dorians did. So it is quite possible, and we do know that there was an exodus out of them when we look at Greek archaeology. There's a whole descendants of Hercules, that whole narrative of what happened to them. I think it's the Dorians again. Yes.
Does the type of wood that is used for firing in the kiln have any effect on the chemical composition of the fired clay?
No.
It makes no difference what it is. It's
Right.
strictly the temperature and not the chemical composition.
It's not impacted.
And in fact, one of the other questions you might ask, how about the inclusion? And so that's one of the things you make sure you're not, when you're analyzing the ceramic, you're not analyzing the inclusions or the pigments or anything else that could affect the chemical composition. So I specifically was looking at the clay itself. So one of the things you would do is you take a couple of, you do some analysis on the surface, a couple of points on the surface, a couple of points underneath, and I always like to look at where a break point is, which is like where the inside fabric, the lattices, try to see if I can get that analyzed. And from that, we can see, one, you can determine how close those numbers match to each other for accuracy precision. And for the most part, I was getting them along with the statistical output that they were all representing the same elements, complemental composition, whether it's the inside or the outside or one of the broken edges.
So you're analyzing many different areas.
Oh, yes.
of such.
Yes. That's basically all that quality control, right? You want to make sure you're not getting pigment or you're not getting an inclusion that, which could affect the elemental compositional elements. But the fire used in the burning process would not. Yes. Yes.
Two questions. First, your analysis is directed toward the northern Mediterranean, toward the adjacent island of Sicily, and then parts to the east and north. Are you considering
Africa?
North African?
Yes. So that's a good question.
And also, what is is it possible that this cultic location that you found had significance beyond Malta, so that there was this cultural influence extending from Malta out and to the north?
So that's a really good question. And I'm going to answer it from a practical point of view. So the reason why there seems to be a greater emphasis on like Sicily or the Eastern Mediterranean, places like that, has a lot to deal with the ability of doing work in North Africa, right? So some of these places are just not the safest places to do archaeological research, right? And so that's really what it comes down to. It is being considered. Matter of fact, I know me and a couple of others have been wanting to get to Algeria. There are certain sites that we think that could be very important to understanding human movement in the Central Mediterranean world, in Algeria, as well as not just Tunisia, which is the obvious place. It's just a matter of access at this point. And so, no, that is not being that's not being discounted. So when I write about it, I do mention that North Africa is a possibility that we need to be considering. Matter of fact, especially when we see ostrich eggs within the archaeological record in Malta, right? That could have came through a North African trade route. Fiancé beads came through a North African trade route. And in fact, I'm going to show you something now, which definitely could have the potential of showing a relationship to North Africa. And that, I'm just going to go through this quick. This is the new research I'm doing that was kind of stimulated with some of my research I'm doing with Tanasi, dealing with LiDAR and photogrammetry, looking at the alignments of these things. This is the archaeoastronomy. And I'm just going to show you this real quick. This particular temple of Borj-Nadar, because of its trace elemental compositional analysis, what we're seeing for some of the charts here says that something's going on here culturally about the specific type of culture change. And in this temple, not like any other temple in Malta, we find these 3 stone pillars at the back of the temple. It's the same temple structure, but we have these 3 stone pillars. And so the question is this thing aligned to anything in the landscape or some celestial body? And not to make a long story long, because we can make it really long, it is. And in fact, there's a group of us going to be published soon in the Applied Journal of Geophysics. My calculations for this temple using photogrammetry and LiDAR indicate, I'll show you this real quick, hold on, is that this temple is oriented to the 3 stars in Orion's belt perfectly at sunset on the winter solstice.
How the heck did they
So when I go back to Malta in a few weeks, I have 3 students coming with me. One of our goals at this moment in time is to look for the post holes that are around Wurz-Nadar. Why? Because we know that post holes we use at Manitra help align and orient the temple to the equinoxes and the solstice. That temple is aligned to those things. Can we find similar post holes at Wurz-Nadar that would be indicative of how they align this temple to Orion? Now, why is this important? Because Orion plays a significant part of the cosmology in North Africa and the Near East. And this particular temple is in the southeastern part of the island. It overlooks the Mediterranean in that direction. Its disembarkation point and its entrance would have been ideal for an African route. Are we seeing the evidence of how culture change happened in Malta between the Targine phase and the Targine cemetery phase through Wurz-Nadar? And were we seeing our first hint of this through the trace elemental compositional analysis, now using LiDAR and photogrammetry, understanding the temple itself in more complex ways? We can now get an idea about their cosmology that helps us understand maybe potential beliefs that were playing out. We do know that in the Gigantia phase, the temples were generally aligned to the Southern Cross and to the False Cross. But in the Targine phase, the temples are aligned to all sorts of things. This particular temple, but how many times I looked at this mathematically using virtual simulation, it's aligned to Orion on the winter solstice at sunset, right? So, yeah.
What do you mean it's aligned to Orion? Like how massive are these stone pillars for one and for the other?
See if I
Are
can
they
show this.
aligned in their placement, or are they aligned in the direction could look at them and
So-
Orion's belt over them?
If you're standing in this, where those 3 pillars are,
Are they in that photo on the right, or is that?
no, that's drone footage.
Okay.
I could show you this real quick. So this is the drone footage we use to do photogrammetry. I don't know, maybe you could see some of this where those pillars are. So if you're standing where those 3 pillars are in blue, and you were looking across the corridor, you could see Orion come above the horizon at sunset on the winter solstice. It comes in clearly.
Through the core.
So we know the azimuth of the central corridor and the azimuth of Orion in that position in Malta, and they align. Now, the question is, what's interesting actually, the first time that this gets perfectly aligned, this alignment happens, is in the year 2770 BC. Prior to 2770 BC, that alignment doesn't happen. Question I have is that the year that this temple was built? Right? I don't know. Who knows? Right? It's all guess.
I have a question. You said you combined with the Southern Cross. I didn't think
These are in the Gigantia phase. The other temples were.
it was not visible in golden hills.
Not at this period, not at this time. So, does that answer your question about the orientation? Why are they, why were the Gigantia temples aligned at that period of time to the Southern Cross and the False Cross? That's a good guess. But that's what other studies have shown. Now, you definitely can see Orion in this part of the hemisphere, and this temple definitely is oriented towards it. Yes.
Is it that they're able to, like in that earlier period when they were aligning to the Southern Cross and False Cross, were they visible?
That's a good question. I would have to look at that. That's what we're working on right now.
Oh,
So
good.
one of the things we're going to be doing at New College is Professor Pirone working with Dr. Roy, brilliant computer specialist. He deals with AI and all things like that. He's the only thing. So we're going to take photogrammetry and LiDAR, and we're going to create virtual spaces so that we have a planetarium that we can physically go inside the temple, and we can see exactly what is visible. Any here we want to explore. So it's not just based on mathematics, but visually see it here, 27 seconds. Can we see what the ancient person saw standing at any location with the complex? Right?
So you have to come back.
I'll have to come back up there. But that's the next phase. So bottom line, I'll conclude with this. The ceramics tells us something interesting. That ceramics played no role really for the most part during the temple period in terms of exchange and trade, except in the Targine phase, we see a unique clustering pattern with shards that are associated with one particular temple, Lord Nadar, that indicates some of those shards are made with clays that are either mixed clays between Maltans and clays from another location, either Sicily or Africa or some other place, right? Or some just completely from some other place. And we know that immediately after this period, we see a whole new repertoire of cultural things happen.
So is innovation?
No, there's no indication of that. Why? We don't see any evidence of warfare or conflict. And we don't even see walls being built until like the middle of the thing. There's nothing like slingshots or anything like that. There's none of that happening. You remember, you got to think about the whole archaeological context. You got to look at every single artifact that has been dug up and analyzed, and think of it in those terms. So, if there's no invasion, what else could it be, right? It could be trade, right? It could be something as simple as, maybe it is the Nostoi, these poems that were telling us something from the Aegean, that these Mycenaean soldiers never returning back to Mycenae and settling in the central Mediterranean. They could be the sea people, literally. The Egyptians wrote about them. So we in some parts of the world, we actually have text that might be explaining some of this during this period. That's why I showed you those two chronologies. We know that the end of the Targine phase does line up nicely with what was going on in the Bronze Age in terms of chronology. So yeah, it's kind of interesting, right? By the way, something fascinating came out of this study. So I sent a friend a memo in the State Department. I said it to them. The guys, this is what the Ukraine and Russia broke out. That war started with them. The guys, we cannot pull our stuff out of the process. This archaeology tells us why. Because material culture influences people's behavior. It has agency. And I said that if we take anything out, we take our Western products out, close down McDonald's, there's only one thing to fill it, and that's food. What? It's food. In other words, taking our products out of Moscow is a bad idea, because guess what? When we see culture change in the archaeological record, when we see corresponding other cultural artifacts that are indicative of human movement and interaction outside that region. And sometimes those artifacts show no evidence of actual physical humans actually from those places those artifacts come from, actually ever being there. It's the artifact itself that is exercising agency on the minds of the people in that location. And in fact, that led me to a different theory. I kind of mentioned it in my dissertation once. I don't know if anyone paid attention to it. But with this idea called relevancy, the theory of relevancy. And again, I think about the Edo period in Japan. When the American merchant ships wound up arriving in Yokohama Bay, the samurai knew their writing was on the wall, that culture change was about to happen. So they had a form of self-imposed abolition of their authority in order to stay relevant within the population and to maintain as much cultural control as possible with the arrival of the American in Yokohama. And I suggest that I think something similar in terms of human cognitive behavior is happening during this time in Malta. That whoever was the ruling class or ruling clergy or whatever we want to call them, they knew that they had to adapt, and they did adapt in order to stay in power. It's called relevancy. especially if you're dealing in a more egalitarian society. I think probably you could say that was the case. What becomes important is the relevancy of people's beliefs and attitudes. I always say democracy and democratic republics and all these places where there's more human involvement in decision making, not money. People think money is the influential thing. No, it's called relevance. There's plenty of billionaires, but not all of them are relevant, right? There's plenty of people that are not that rich who are more relevant and powerful. So I think relevancy becomes an important role in culture change. You see culture change happen when material culture changes within the archaeological record. And I have a feeling that the agency of those objects is playing a role on the cognition of people who are using them. And that's why I made that conclusion. Anyways, that's it from me. Thank you. I went over by 2 minutes on that. I hope you enjoyed that.
Anybody have any questions? We have 2 minutes. Any questions?
Yes.
So the foreign materials.
Yeah.
Could they be ballast?
Could be. Quite possible. That's why I'm answering. Why am I answering that? Because I don't have any.
Well, with the illustrations and ships that you saw in the would they have used ballast like this?
We can reconstruct that in that picture. It could have.
It can be a balance.
Yeah, I mean, it could be. I'll see it. It's quite possible. But the problem with that is that it's hard to really tell from the reading the composition of that. We can make a guess. It could be I call it the table. It's like the table of possible. It's a potential explanation of potential thing that you look for, but without any evidence in the archaeological record, you can't say it. Right? But it could be, yes.
Brits came here, they traded to use fired brick as ballast.
Yeah, and
that was essentially scrap, and then they substituted.
So,
yeah, and they took trade goods from here, ballast, back.
So so when I'm thinking about when I think about what has been discovered in terms of the material that we used in ship making or boat making, clay was not something that was predominantly used in this period of time in any of the seafaring vessels. I mean, that's how I would answer. Could tomorrow I wake up and some archaeologist who has a scuba diving license digs something up and says something different? Yes, that's always a possibility. But right now in the archaeological record, there's nothing to indicate that any of these seafaring vessels had any part of it made using clay. Right. And the other question is, I mean, we don't even have anything that would suggest that they had any type of sail at this point either.
One more question?
I think someone else.
I'll answer all questions.
I'm still hung up on that calyx shirt.
Yeah.
Is it all right? With the pottery that you have, you were talking about the details of what you're observing. You haven't mentioned temper. How are we tempering our pottery here?
That's a good question. So let's talk about the temper. Maltese ceramics, they do have temper. They have inclusion. They're using a lot of limestone because that's what predominantly the island is made of. We know that from a study that was done in 1986 by a scholar named Martha Molitor, who after her dissertation, she kind of disappears. Right? She doesn't do anything in archaeology since. She talks about the temper that was used. She actually talks about how the ancient Maltese made their ceramic. And she does mention the temper that was included. So they use limestone. There's some other types of granule inclusions like greens. That doesn't affect the chemical composition.
Well, no, that's the temper.
Right. Now, my study didn't look at the temper, to be honest. So I mean, I can't tell you each of those shards what the temper was of each of those, right? From one period to the next. But that's not what I was looking at.
So you're identifying these different wares by style and surface treatment.
Yes.
Primary.
And yeah. So we're looking at something very specific, right? And I'm also asking a specific question, right? If I wanted to know about their cooking wear, I would have to worry about their temper at that point, right? If I wanted to talk about something specific in terms of use, yeah, that would have been something I would have looked at. But in terms of the calyx, we know based on its stylistic features that it was a drinking vessel. We could do residue analysis, right? Residue analysis would tell us the phosphate, amino acids, and proteins, like potentially the thing, the liquid that was in it, right? Matter of fact, I think Tanasi did some residue analysis and discovered at some point the earliest, I forgot where it was, the earliest use of wine, right? So yeah, we know that we could potentially use residue analysis on it. That'd be a great future study. Residue analysis on the calyx of the